So that's an example of a popular piety that isn't officially recognized. As we wind down this period, of course, we're talking now at the Renaissance, and so we're not focused on Western cultural heritage, and so you've gotten some of that in those courses. I just want to highlight some things related to specifically religious aspects. Now, certainly during the Renaissance, there were a variety of changes in art, but in many respects, often the subject of art was still Christian stories. Eventually, it will move on to other types of subjects like just general people, portraits, nature scenes, etc. But early on, it's Christian stories are the subjects. You have a revival of classicism at this time, an interest in the art of Roman times, or being shaped or influenced by Roman philosophy. And there's also an interest in observing the natural world. There's a shift that takes place in paintings. Instead of paintings that were largely two-dimensional, there's an interest in trying to add a third dimension, or the appearance of a third dimension, in painting. As I mentioned, eventually you start seeing more common or secular subjects coming in, nature scenes, panoramas. But in churches you have frescoes, which are painted on wet plaster, other types of paintings that will decorate churches. Perhaps two of the most memorable and two of the greatest of these artists, especially of the later, what's known as the High Renaissance, are Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti, two of the most in-demand artists of the High Renaissance. Da Vinci was a painter, scientist, inventor, musician from the small town of Vinci near Florence in Italy, and he appears to have been gifted in multiple ways, including engineering, kind of as a proto-engineer, and helped with the drainage problems in France, while also designing prototypes for airplanes and submarines and all sorts of other things we could talk about. Perhaps his most famous religious painting is The Last Supper. It is a fresco painting. So it was painted as a mural on a plaster wall and was originally painted on a dining hall in a monastery in Milan. And so on the other side of the painting for several years was the kitchen. And so, that might have messed up some of the painting because of all the heat and everything that would have been behind this wall. Very, very familiar painting, depicts Jesus at the table with his disciples. The moment here is supposed to be when Jesus has just said, "One of you will betray me." And the apostles kind of drawing back in shock or surprise at what he has said. Jesus sits in front of three windows which provide the light for the scene and are said to symbolize the three persons of the Trinity. And of course, Jesus, in a sense, is isolated here because of this drawing back and debate that's taking place. Here sits Judas Iscariot. You can't make it out too much, but his elbow on the table, already clutching the bag of silver that is going to be his payment for betraying Jesus. And what's interesting here for a lot of scholars of art is the attempt to present these kind of true human emotions on these faces. Michelangelo was a sculptor primarily, but also an architect, a painter, and even a poet. His patrons for some of his early career were the Medici family in Florence. So when they lose power, he will go to Bologna and then eventually to Rome. Many of his works, though not all of them, have religious subjects at their core, and he was often called upon to do sculpture for a variety of churches as well. An example of this might be the Pieta. a sculpture of Mary holding Jesus who's just been taken down from the cross. Michelangelo is not the only one to have done such a sculpture. There are sculptures of, other sculptures, essentially, they would look very, very similar. Often, they would be much smaller than his was and of wood rather than marble. Additionally, Mary in this version appears to be much younger and more beautiful than in others where she has a 33-year-old son, but this woman doesn't look old enough to have a 33-year-old son. And many people will point to the impressive ability that Michelangelo has to imitate flesh and fabric in the marble. I mean, it almost looks like at parts that it is fabric as opposed to stone. One of the few sculptures that's signed, people would attribute it to some other guy, and so Michelangelo actually signed it on the sash. You can't see it on this picture. He also did statues of David and Moses, other figures as well. Of his paintings, the Sistine Chapel is perhaps the best known. So Pope Julius II had commissioned Michelangelo to create a huge tomb for him that was going to be 3 levels, that was to include sculpted figures on these various levels, and ultimately at the top an effigy of the Pope. It was never finished because as Michelangelo would be working on it, Julius would decide he wanted Michelangelo to do something else. And so he would constantly kind of back and forth call him to do these things. And so once that happened, then once Julius died, then other popes kept him from completing it as well. In the midst of working on the tomb, Julius wanted him to paint a fresco on the ceiling of the chapel of Pope Sixtus IV, which is not something he wanted to do. He thought of himself as a sculptor. And you've probably heard I just released these figures from marble. It's kind of like these figures are trapped in the marble, and Michelangelo saw himself as releasing them. Plus, the shape of the ceiling, there were other technical problems. It's just not appealing to him. So he decides to kind of leave Rome to avoid this. But the Pope orders him back. The ceiling is 5,800 square feet. It is 70 feet above the floor. It includes 300 figures and took 3 years to complete. Here's a picture. You're probably not going to be able to catch much of the design, but as you come in through the doors, the very front is a different painting. We'll talk about that in a second. Michelangelo divided the piece into separate frames that include images of prophets, biblical scenes, and then other figures, including pagan female prophets. And so in these triangular spots, you have, well, at least here, you have depictions of people in the line of Jesus, and these square figures alternating prophet, female, pagan prophet, another prophet from the Bible, etc. In the center are scenes from the Bible, starting from creation through Noah being drunk after the flood. And so kind of the first several chapters of Genesis. The entrance of this chapel is where Noah gets drunk, and so as you move to the front of the altar is where you get to God separating light from darkness. This picture, I know you can't read it too much, tells you, what are at the different places. In the corners, Judith's slaying of Holofernes is actually from the Apocrypha. It's not from the Bible. David slaying Goliath, Haman from the Book of Esther, the bronze serpent from Moses raising the bronze serpent, and then the different people in the line of Jesus. And then, as you can say, the Delphic fiddle, right, pagan prophet, in between Zechariah and Isaiah. Again, that classical style, right? And so this renewed interest in Roman culture and Greek culture. He would go on to paint the Last Judgment on the wall behind the altar that would be in the front of the chapel. He did that some 30 years afterward. I'm not going to spend too much time about architecture or music. Largely the Gothic style still tended to predominate, but architecture begins to vary by region. But in general, there is an interest in creating even higher cathedrals. And how high can we go? English architects especially were interested in trying to achieve greater and greater height. You also see in some places the incorporation of domes, and then that tried to, became an architectural problem, challenge. How do you get this dome to spread this span? How do you support it? Particularly as people are trying to get rid of flying buttresses, they don't like them, and so we're trying to eliminate those. And there's also the interest to try and mimic the classical style, and so arches and columns in both religious and secular buildings. But there's less of an attempt to try and convey the ethereal, right? And so this kind of the spiritual world, and more of a desire to present something as part of the natural world for many people. And so in some places it's not so much about the height as it is of just kind of a natural looking building. With respect to music, the major difference here is that musicians tend to move towards non-religious types of subjects. And so as architecture becomes more secular, music is becoming more secular as well. And so you see the development of love ballads, of people writing songs about contemporary events, as opposed to songs that are inherently religious in nature. Especially with religious works, you see the introduction of harmony, as opposed to any sort of standard singing or antiphonal singing back and forth, particularly to the songs that were part of the everyday mass. Songs like the Kyrie eleison, the Gloria, the Credo, which was the profession of faith, the Sanctus and Benedictus, which were sung right before the Eucharistic prayer, and the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, sung right before communion. And so introducing harmony into those instead of just kind of a monotone unison type of stuff. Questions, comments about art, architecture, or music during the time? All right, if not, we will